The Man Who Walked Away, Nietzsche's Leap into the Abyss. The story begins in silence. Not the peaceful kind, the crushing, ringing silence that follows a life lived too far from its truth. Friedrich Nietzsche stood at the window of his Basel apartment one cold morning in 1879, watching the street lamps flicker out one by one. The city was waking up without him. For years he had walked these streets as a respected professor of philology, the youngest ever appointed at the University of Basel. A prodigy. A scholar with a future carved out in stone. But on this particular morning, Nietzsche knew the stone had cracked. He had been wrestling with a decision for months. His migraines had become torrential storms behind his eyes. His eyesight blurred. Nausea came in waves that left him leaning over the edge of his desk, gasping. But the pain he suffered most wasn't physical. It was deeper, far more corrosive. He felt he was living someone else's life. In the quiet of that morning, with the snow melting on the rooftops and the city bells beginning to toll, he whispered to himself a sentence that would alter the course of modern thought. I can no longer live divided. And with trembling hands he drafted a letter, simple, polite, and devastatingly final, resigning his professorship. He was 34. This is the story of what happened after that fall, how Nietzsche stepped away from the prestige, the salary, the security, the academic throne, and into a wilderness of solitude, illness, and obscurity, all to become the very philosopher who would reshape the world. The young prodigy who didn't belong. Before Nietzsche became the nomadic outsider we know him as today, he was the golden child of German academia. He published brilliant work as a university student, wrote confidently on Greek tragedy, and impressed senior scholars so thoroughly that Basel offered him a professorship at only 24. Others spent decades climbing toward that rank. But from the start, Nietzsche felt he was trespassing. Philology, the study of ancient languages, was a cage for him. He admired the classics, but not the methodical dissection of them. He wanted to understand the soul, the fire, the raw human condition beating beneath the words of Aeschylus and Heraclitus. Yet academia demanded footnotes, careful distinctions, and endless references. Nietzsche wanted thunder. Still, he tried to play the role. Lectures, committee meetings, polite scholarly debates, he performed them all. But he was already drifting toward dangerous territory. Instead of producing purely philological papers, he wrote The Birth of Tragedy, a bold philosophical work that blended art, myth, psychology, and cultural prophecy. Academics were horrified. One critic famously accused him of speculation, mysticism, and romantic excess. Another said the book had no place on a philologist's shelf. Nietzsche felt the walls tightening around him. He was a philosopher trying to breathe inside a scholar's lungs. But something even more consequential pierced his life: pain. Chronic, relentless, disfiguring pain. 2. A body breaking while a mind awakens. The migraines were monstrous, blinding, vomiting, days spent in a darkened room gripping the sides of the bed. His eyesight was deteriorating rapidly. He once said he could barely read his own handwriting. Walking too far exhausted him. Teaching became impossible. Doctors offered little comfort beyond rest and resignation. Basel granted Nietzsche multiple leaves of absence, and he used those periods to write. Not academic essays, but philosophical experiments, aphorisms, attacks on certainty, and celebrations of artistic creation. Every page he wrote moved him a little further away from the world he inhabited. His students liked him. His colleagues respected him. But Nietzsche knew he was a guest in that life, never a citizen of it. He began to travel when his health allowed: Italy, Switzerland, the French Riviera. He wrote in rented rooms, in small inns, on mountain paths. Every journey made the cage of his professorship feel heavier, less survivable. His friends warned him. The university was security. A salary. A title. If he resigned, there was no safety net. No health insurance. No guarantee of readers. Philosophy was not a profession. It was a gamble, and he had already lost too much. But Nietzsche felt summoned. Summoned to write. To challenge everything. to carve a new language for human experience, to awaken an inner voice that had waited too long. The cost would be enormous. But he saw the alternative clearly: mediocrity and comfort. He chose struggle and truth. 3. The day he let go. In July 1879, Nietzsche walked to the university carrying a letter of resignation. His gait was slow. The migraines had been especially violent that season. The summer sun made him squint. The world felt like a blurred painting. When he handed the letter to the rector, he felt what he later described as a lightening of the soul. Not joy, more like a release. Like loosening a rope tied too tightly around one's chest. The university reluctantly accepted. His colleagues were stunned. His family was worried. Some called it an early failure. Others whispered that he had gone mad. Nietzsche only said, "I am not a man. I am dynamite." But dynamite doesn't explode quietly. It needs time, pressure, solitude. And Nietzsche was about to enter the loneliest period of his life. 4. Into the desert of self. With no home, no university duties, and no financial stability, Nietzsche became a wanderer. He moved through Switzerland, Italy, and southern France, living off a small pension and the charity of friends. Sometimes he found tiny mountain towns where the air eased his symptoms. Other times he collapsed into sickness for weeks. He wrote in a shaky hand. He wrote in bed. He wrote outdoors, leaning against rocks, notebook on his knee. He wrote through migraines so severe he could barely see the page. But he kept writing. He wrote human, all too human. Then the dawn. Then the gay science. Then thus spoke Zarathustra, his masterpiece, a book unlike anything before or since, half scripture, half storm. The man who once dissected Greek grammar was now creating a new mythic language. He walked away from the university, but toward his own voice. Yet the world ignored him. His books barely sold. Sometimes only a few dozen copies. Critics mocked his style. Scholars dismissed him as a renegade. Friends distanced themselves, unsettled by his intensity. He wrote anyway. He once described his life in these years as a long listening. Listening to what? To himself. To the subterranean layers of thought that academia had never allowed him to excavate. His solitude became a forge. The transformation. Nietzsche the professor had been careful, polite, methodical. Nietzsche the philosopher, freed from rank, obligation, and public expectation, became radical. He developed a philosophy of life rather than textbooks. The will to power, the drive to grow, to overcome, to expand one's horizons. The death of God, not atheism, but the collapse of old certainties in a modern world. The Übermensch, the ideal human who creates values instead of inheriting them. Eternal recurrence, the ultimate test of whether one loves one's life. He became a philosopher of becoming, of transformation, of breaking one's old self and forging a new one. And the roots of this philosophy were personal. Every idea he recorded was born from his own struggle to remake himself outside the boundaries of tradition. Where others saw suffering, he saw alchemy. He believed deeply that greatness required rupture. A leap. A moment of abandoning the known world to discover the self beneath it. His own resignation became the defining myth of his thought, the act of stepping outside the herd. He later wrote, "Become who you are." A simple sentence, and for Nietzsche, a lifelong battle cry. 6. Isolation, misunderstanding, and the shadow of tragedy. For all the brilliance of this period, Nietzsche lived in almost total isolation. He was sick, poor, often depressed. He proposed marriage to 3 different women, all 3 rejected him. His friendship with Richard Wagner, once the emotional center of his life, crumbled into bitter disappointment. He wrote with volcanic intensity, yet no one read him. He poured out his soul into books that gathered dust in forgotten shelves. He believed he was speaking to the future. But the present refused to listen. There were days he felt triumphant, like a prophet on a mountaintop. And days he felt crushed, like a ghost wandering the cities of Europe unnoticed. His pain did not lessen. His vision worsened. His body deteriorated. But his voice grew sharper, freer, more dangerous. By the mid-1880s, Nietzsche was writing works so audacious, so fiercely independent, that he felt he had stepped beyond the entire history of Western philosophy. And yet, he ate simple meals alone. He had no home. He walked the streets unrecognized. He had sacrificed the stability of the university for a vision that even he feared might be too large for one human life. But he never regretted the leap. Later he would proclaim, "One must still have chaos within oneself to give birth to a dancing star." He had chosen chaos. And he created a universe. 7. The final collapse, and the legacy born after. In 1889, after 10 years of solitary brilliance, Nietzsche suffered a mental collapse in Turin. The exact cause remains debated: illness, exhaustion, perhaps neurological disease. But the Nietzsche who emerged from that breakdown was no longer the same man. For the remaining 11 years of his life, he lived in the care of his mother and sister, unable to write or work. He never saw the world change around his words. He died in 1900, unknown, unread, misunderstood. But then something extraordinary happened. The early 20th century rediscovered him. Philosophers, poets, psychologists, painters, everyone felt the shockwave of his thought. Sigmund Freud adopted elements of Nietzsche's psychological insights. Thomas Mann drew on him for literary depth. Modern existentialism, Sartre, Camus, owes him its foundation. Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, all built on Nietzsche's ruins. Artists, musicians, revolutionaries, counterculture movements, all discovered him. The man who resigned from the university believing he might be forgotten became one of the most influential thinkers in human history. He had walked away from the safety of institutional life into the unknown, and in doing so, he created a philosophy that set the world on fire. His story is not a story of success. It is a story of courage. The courage to live one's truth, even at unbearable cost. 8. What Nietzsche's leap means for us. Nietzsche's turning point, the resignation in 1879, is one of the great existential acts in modern history. He did not leave the university because he failed. He left because he refused to betray the voice inside him. He understood something timeless. You can be successful and still be in the wrong life. You can be admired and still be invisible to yourself. You can follow the path everyone expects and feel the soul draining from your veins. Nietzsche teaches us that transformation is not gentle. It requires rupture, honesty, and often solitude. He paid the price. But he also gained the power to become who he truly was. In one of his final lucid writings, he said, "Do not be afraid of your solitude. Where the crowd ends, the great human beings begin." Nietzsche walked away from the crowd. And in the silence that followed, a new world of thought was born. 9. The man who walked into his own legend. If you were to imagine Nietzsche that morning in Basel, standing by the window with his resignation letter, he would not look like a man confident in victory. He looked tired, ill-worried. But there was something else in his expression, a spark, faint yet unmistakable. A man realizing that the path ahead would be brutal, lonely, and perhaps fatal. But that it was the only path where his soul could breathe. He once wrote, "The secret of a fulfilled life is to live dangerously." Nietzsche did. He stepped into uncertainty with nothing but a pen, his pain, and a storm inside his mind. The world he left behind barely noticed. The world he created has never been the same.